Okay.
So let's start with the first question.
Great.
Question number one. I'm curious about your workflow for restoring interim crown to patient on the same day.
Interim crowns for patient on the same day. Okay. So interims mean different things to different people, but for me, that's provisional. And I typically don't do, so for me, provisionals for single unit or maybe even a couple of units, I'm going to go ahead and still do it the traditional way. I might have a digital design done before the appointment, but I'll usually use a putty and bisacryl material because overall, I've gotten to the point where I can make a nice fitting provisional for most restorations, especially my partial biomimetic restorations where they don't have they have to be shrink wrapped on. You can't necessarily cement them in. They have to wrap around the tooth. So because of that reason, using bisacryl and a high quality putty or a really good pre-op impression, I can make the provisional in maximum 5 minutes. Sometimes with a crown 5-6 minutes, with a inlay onlay something partial coverage, it's probably 3 or 4 minutes and adjust occlusion. That's it. So I usually don't want to 3D print those. But if you're doing quadrants or larger, I do like to do 3D printed, especially when I have a pre-op design or a preliminary design, so that I can be very true to that. I can also make sure that if we've opened the vertical or digitally planned the case, we can be true to that throughout the treatment. So in the last full mouth case I did, I had printed the provisionals for the case so that I could be very true to the design, make sure the occlusion was right on. So that's when I'm doing 3D printed, but otherwise, I think the time benefit for one or two is still not there yet. You can also try doing the 3D printed shells before the appointment and reline them. That's also not a bad approach, but all in all, I don't find that necessary for one or two teeth, and I would reserve that for more like a quadrant of crowns or something like that.
It means for single crown, just you use the powder and liquid resin.
Well, powder and liquid was one way, and I did that for years. That would be with like PMMA, but I'm using the putty and bisacryl, which is the gun material that basically auto mixes. And there's a few of them out there. My favorite one is Visalis from Keatonbach because it is a very strong material. I never really have problems with it fracturing, so that minimizes post-op visits for problems with the temporary. So that's what I usually use for a lot of these cases.
Okay, thank you. Question number two. Is there any clinical tip to have a perfect marginal fit when I want to do with modeless treatment?
A perfect marginal fit when you're doing modeless treatment. That's a good question. So I assume we're talking about 3D printing. So first of all, me personally, whether it's 3D printed or milled, I am a huge fan of having fail safes and backups and quality checks. So I will never do fully modelless, but what I have gotten comfortable with is not checking occlusion, but I want to check the contacts, the marginal fit, etc. And so I don't skip the model on most cases unless it's a one visit, same day case, in which case the patient's going to be my model and I'll check in their mouth. But for any case that's not done in the same day, I prefer to have the models. And I don't have any absolute tips for that because it all comes down to the quality of your scan and how much time you spend in the design and finishing, but you have to make sure you get calibrated with your proximal contacts and occlusion. Sometimes the software might say that you have a good contact, but I've noticed different things, like depending on what material I'm printing with, I might want to have a lighter contact or a heavier contact, depending on how much I'm going to glaze the restoration. Like if I'm going to do very minimal glazing and avoid glazing the interproximal areas, maybe I don't need to have, maybe I can have a little bit of a tighter contact. But if I'm going to be glazing the whole thing, I might want to leave a little bit of space so that I don't end up tight and having to adjust. So I guess what I would say is getting calibrated, and it's the same for everything, even if it's veneers for the anterior, getting calibrated with your impression technique or your scan technique, the material and the technician or the technology. When you're doing this stuff, you might be the technician and the technology, and you're in charge of it. So you just have to get calibrated. And what we normally do is we write down if we notice that the occlusion was high or the contacts had a lot of adjustment, and I check it and I start kind of fine tuning in. So it's all based on the material and what you're going to do.
Okay, thank you for answering that.
Of course.
So we are left with the last question. So
Okay.
question number 3. How do you utilize Medit's clinic CAD in your clinic? Do you sometimes design simple prostheses by yourself?
So I'm using Medit Clinic CAD, as I showed you, for
Yeah.
American bridges. For bridges, I have other cool cases where we've used 3D printed 6-unit bridge. I've done a Maryland bridge with 4 pontics. I've done the Essex tray. Well, the Essex was with design, but that's soon going to end up being part of Medit Clinic CAD as it continues to grow and expand. I've done an inlay and a crown with it. And yes, I do the designing for these things. I'm training one of my staff members, and she's growing very fast, and she's doing my splints and my what else is she doing? Splints and models. But when it comes to designing this stuff, I feel like I need to master it before I delegate it. It's one of the things that's very important for me to grow and for the quality to stay the way I want. If I delegate it, I know I'm not going to be happy with the results, and I'm not going to know how to fix it. So I do most of the design, and I actually really enjoy it, and I think it helps me learn in very many ways. So that's how I'm using Medit Clinic CAD.
Wow. Okay, so it was all about today's quiz that are prepared for today.
Yes.
So you'll be able to watch this webinar on our YouTube channel and Medit Academy once it's completed. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
Thank you.
See you next time. Bye.
See you next time.